Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati Podcast, where we dive into how emerging technologies will impact the world and your bank account. I'm Trent Fowler, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, Thomas Fry. Thomas and I are futurists, keynote speakers, and consultants with decades of experience in analyzing trends and communicating new developments to audiences across the world. Reach out to us at futuratipodcast.com/contact-futurati if you'd like to hire us for consulting, to speak at your event, or to advertise on our podcast. So, Thomas, you and I just wrapped up a fascinating and wide-ranging interview with Alan Farrington and Sacha Meyers, who are the co-authors of this excellent book, Bitcoin is Venice, that's made something of a stir in the crypto community. I thought that the conversation was just fantastic. It's one that I've wanted to have for a long time. How did you feel about it?
Yeah, they came at this from a number of different angles that are new and refreshing. So I found it absolutely intriguing. And we asked some good questions to kind of challenge their assumptions and challenge where they were coming from. And so they were very articulate in how they approached the answers.
Yeah, that's true. So after we wrapped recording, they were talking about how they're not sure they invented anything with the book or they actually innovated. It's mostly a recombination, remix of prior ideas that you can find in classical economists like Carl Menger or Hayek or Mises. But they connect it in lots of very interesting ways. They connect it to this new technology called Bitcoin, and they extrapolate that into the future to imagine how it might change the financial system, how it might change things like social capital. And on the whole, I think that's all very valuable stuff. That remix and reinvention is very important work.
Yeah, and they did a good job, I think, of challenging the listeners to new concepts. And so I presented them with the analogy that that the iPhone is to the telephone industry what Bitcoin is to the money industry. And I thought their answer was quite fascinating. So with that, I invite everybody to listen to this and find out what their answer really was.
Hope you guys like it. Tonight, we're joined by Alan Farrington and Sacha Meyers. Alan and Sacha are both investors in traditional finance who draw heavily on philosophy, history, and economics to understand Bitcoin, how it is evolving, and how it will likely change the world in the future. If you enjoy this interview, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. And don't forget to check out our website, futuratipodcast.com. Guys, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Let's hear a little bit about your respective backgrounds, your interests, and what brought you to working on the projects you're working on today.
Cool. I think actually Sacha should go first because mine is like the same up to a point.
Oh, right.
Just fork off the Sacha branch.
Yeah, yeah, and then we forked.
Was it a hard fork?
No, it was very soft fork.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah. So I'm Sacha, and my background before my career where I met Alan was studying environmental sciences. Then Alan and I joined an investment firm. I've been working there for 7 years. Alan's now doing his own thing, and he's been doing that for a few months. He'll talk about it himself. Really, my interest has been and continues to be around understanding capital in its varied forms. So not just the financial monetary form that people will be familiar with, but trying to extend that notion of capital as a potential energy of production, something that we can use to make things that are useful to us, and try and really understand the different ways in which that model can be applied. So that's something I've been quite interested in developing, especially in the book.
Yeah, we will be coming back to that. Alan, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm Alan. I studied math and philosophy. Then, as Sacha mentioned, met him in my first and now probably only ever adult job, investment management firm. I left a couple of months ago now, to start up my own Bitcoin business, basically, which we might go into a little. I mean, it's a little tricky because there's not that much I can say about it because it's not public yet. I assume by the time this podcast comes out, it probably wouldn't have made that much progress with it. But it does touch on a couple of the ideas that are in the book, because when we were finishing the book, which is a very lengthy process, I'm sure we'll talk about that too, the very end of writing the book was the very beginning of the idea for this business. And so there was a little bit of overlap there. So once it is like more well-known, people might be able to go back and be like, that's what he was talking about.
Yeah, we were going to talk about the book right now, but actually, I think this episode is going to come out in like 6 or 8 weeks. So if you can get it off the ground in 6 weeks, then
maybe.
Yeah, maybe, right? Maybe. Yeah. So I did want to talk about the methodology behind the book, because I think that, one thing that struck all of us as we read it was how erudite it is and how many different sources and ideas you two draw from. And so I wanted to know whether or not you two had this kind of vague idea that there might be a connection between Bitcoin and like urban planning in Renaissance Italy, or if you're just the sorts of gentlemen who sit around reading, obscure out of print books about urban planning in Renaissance Italy and soil science and all this other shit. And then it's like, oh, we could actually make something out of this. So walk us through the development of it.
So, I mean, I have a take on this that may be completely different from Sacha's. I'm not sure. I almost feel like it'd be better if Sacha just dropped off the call, I answered, and then he came back. No, but my take on it is that, like, we know, we've been, I think, fairly upfront about this. It even says in the introduction how unusual the writing process was for the book, in that, first of all, a lot of it was written as standalone pieces first anyway, and then we later thought, oh, we could actually maybe tie these together a bit more and extend some of the thinking. The time at which we had that thought, though, was lockdown, when we had absolutely nothing else to do, or not even, well, we had a lot else to do. It was illegal to do anything at all other than sit inside and read and write. And I think that itself catalyzed something that had maybe been building for a while, which was, not only had, some portion, maybe like half or so of the content had been written already and it didn't need to be adapted, but like the core ideas were there. I think the fact that we had this sort of push to start getting all this stuff down on paper in the book was super helpful, because what it pushed us to do was actually crystallize what we had been talking about for like 5 years. So honestly, it's going to sound really weird. I'm sure probably very few books are written this way, especially because this was co-authored, right? So like most of the time you wouldn't even have the opportunity to do this, but a lot of the writing was finding old chats, like digging up old email threads where, we really should have been working, but we were actually just like bantering about what is capital. And so it was a very unusual process. I don't think we could repeat it if we tried. It was highly circumstantial. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy with it at least. So now let's hear Sacha's experience.
I would say that our book, like any successful medieval city, was very much a bottom-up organic enterprise.
Yeah,
it's an emergent order from just long-standing chat logs from two DeFi degenerates who should have been working.
Yeah, exactly. So you've talked about the different things that we discuss in the book, and that really owes more to our general interests in different things and the way in which we like reading and then discussing these ideas. Forming that into a coherent narrative is only something that we started realizing could be done as it was being written. So we started really with essays, as Alan said, and then strings of essays were written in a way that articulated our thought process at the time as well. It's not just that we have a master plan that we're going to execute. We're really thinking as we go, and we're trying to link that to whatever came before and might come after. That whole creates a book that we then, of course, were able to pad and add to once we had a better understanding for what the book might look like as a whole. And once we decided, yeah, okay, we've got enough here to create a book, then yeah, it's about being a bit more strategic and saying maybe we need to read a few more books about the Venetians or the Medici, but that does come later. It comes after just a general interest for medieval cities and the way capital accumulates.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it's a book about medieval cities and how capital accumulates. That's it.
So yeah, it's not at all a book about Bitcoin, by the way. It's worth just getting that blatant fake news out the way up front.
Well, actually,
I just think of that as being like genius clickbait, really.
Oh, I saw that. I was like, well, I can't not read that. What the hell does that mean? Yeah. So it's the one weird trick for like really bright people who are like far out on the right end of the bell curve. Now I know authors tend to hate this sort of thing, especially authors that work in such a bottom up collaborative way. But I mean, if you had like 2 or 3 core insights, we're going to try to TikTok this, and we might TikTok it, by the way. Yeah, like this might go on TikTok.
You're gonna have a dance that goes along with our answer.
We always have a dance. There's an intro dance. Yeah. So do you have sort of like a press release version of this that you would want to communicate? If somebody's not going to read it, but they might be interested in the ideas, what would you say? Because I could think of like 5 or 6 that are plausible, you know.
I feel like we probably should be able to just rattle this off the top of our heads. I'll give it a go. So something like, so capital is not money. They are importantly different, but importantly related, right? They're not completely distinct from one another. They are, the way in which they are related is to do with properly communicating value, and that once you grasp it, extends well beyond economics. It obviously applies to economics, but it also, you know, notions of value can mean a lot more than just price. And that the way it doesn't have nothing at all to do with Bitcoin. It does mention Bitcoin quite a lot. So even that was kind of,
it is in the title.
The way that we then do link it to Bitcoin is that the truer the signal with which you're communicating value, how would you put it? The better and more healthily everybody is able to communicate in the first place and plan and grow, I suppose. Right. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I don't know, Sacha, how would you either add to that or just ignore all that and start again?
No, I'd add, say that in order to accumulate wealth, you need to be able to collaborate. And to be able to collaborate, you're going to need a tool to do that at scale that no central party can tamper with. That leads you to Bitcoin.
I really like that. Yeah, I really like that. Why is the untamperability of it so important?
So it really gets back to the idea of how you think capital accumulates in the first place. If you do believe that a central authority can, by decree, come to an understanding of what needs to happen, you can absolutely go down the line of saying that you need tampering, in the sense that tampering is the planning which will lead to the desired outcome. If, on the other hand, your understanding for accumulation of capital is that of a system where decentralized individuals collaborate willingly and through iterative trial and error come to understand more and more about their lived environment and experience, so that they can through understanding what works, what is true, build something that is of value to each other. If that's your understanding of capital, then you cannot have a central authority that starts to tamper with it, because by definition, the accumulation of capital is a system that requires effective communication between individuals, that none of whom have a master plan for the whole community.
This is very Hayekian. It seems like it could plausibly be construed as a continuation of F.A. Hayek's work. So why is the I mean, I have some guesses, but why is capital some sort of like communicative mechanism? I mean, it seems like you could tie that in with price theory. You could tie that in with a couple of other things.
I wouldn't say capital exactly, as I just say that prices are.
Right.
Yeah, and it's good that you actually just mentioned Hayek, because I'm thinking, do we have anything to add to him? Probably not. I think where the odd places in the book where I think maybe do say something original is more extending the understanding of what even counts as capital. I think that's where the parts of the book where we had the most fun in the first place, sort of teasing out that it's not just an economic issue, right? It's that the same rough concerns that you would have. You know, here's maybe a more interesting way of putting it. You can frame what would normally be talked about as purely an economic problem or an economic issue, even doesn't need to be a problem necessarily, but you can describe it with non-economic terms and frameworks and so on, that are very obviously extended to other realms, but which are perfectly accurate in that setting. So, I mean, Sacha's already done this, I think, in his previous answer, talking about communicating and planning and intent and all that kind of thing, rather than just trading and prices. But ultimately, our argument, I guess, is it's the same thing. It's all about accurately communicating what individuals value.
Why is it that prices alone are not enough for that?
What do you mean? Did
Well,
he say
so
that?
no. Well, I mean, maybe you didn't. So maybe you'd say no, they're just fine. They just have to be accurate. So that could be your answer. I don't know. So is that your answer? That like prices work fine if they're left free to function? I mean, I remember in the earlier third of the book, statements kind of to that effect, that if you leave prices alone, then they can coordinate economic activity. This is the core insight of price theory, right? How prices coordinate economic activity. So maybe that's just your answer, that it's
I think
fine.
maybe there is some interesting nuance there around like price alone isn't everything. I wonder if maybe this is what you were getting at, that it's almost like the least bad option or something like that. It's the untampered with price is the best reflection of the crowdsourced truth, to the extent the contributors to the price actually believe whatever they're doing that affects the price in the first place. Yeah. So, but there is an interesting wrinkle there, and that doesn't mean that it's true, right? It's not like objectively the best reflection of whatever the underlying reality is. It's the best per how everybody contributing to it has acted, and you would guess is therefore is willing to act. But I'm even kind of struggling to articulate this well, I think, because I'm dancing around that value is subjective. I think that's basically what ties all of this together as kind of a nice little truism almost, right? That price is objective. You can observe the price at which a trade takes place, and it kind of has a reality, if you like, right? But it's the very low, well, one-dimensional, I suppose, reflection of an incomprehensibly complex subjective reality that everybody experiences on their own. And hence, I think that this is obviously right back to Hayek, right? This is why prices are so useful, that it's absolutely not possible for anybody to effectively communicate their subjective value in how they experience it, right? But you can communicate it with your actions in the market, and then that gets distilled as price, and that's extremely easy to communicate because it's just one number, or one number, right? Everything will have its own price, I guess, but for everything that it would be useful to have a price, there is only one, and you don't need to sit around talking about how you feel.
Yeah, that's go ahead.
Yeah, let me come at this from a really weird other angle here.
Oh, great.
Okay.
So whatever you're about to say, we'll make it into the second edition for sure.
Okay. Yeah. So somewhere back in ancient history, there was an archaeologist that was digging up stuff in these ancient cities, and he came across this object, which ended up being the original Bitcoin, which was, he dug it up, and it was, we'll call it Bitcoin Alpha, and he dusted off and everything. And then we started endowing Bitcoin Alpha with all these attributes to make it what it is today. And we're still trying to figure out what all attributes it should have to make it the ideal both currency and store of value and tool for commerce. And as it turns out, this archaeologist that was digging up stuff was actually Satoshi Nakamoto, because he's lived for centuries. And so this is kind of the legend of Bitcoin as it's forming in our minds at this moment. Am I getting it right?
I mean, I don't want to say you're getting it wrong, but I'm not really sure what that captures exactly.
All right. Yeah. Well, we're still trying to figure out where Bitcoin fits in society. We're still trying to figure out how it's going to evolve and what changes are going to take place over the coming years to make it more useful and more adaptable and serve us in the long term. Is that correct?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So I think there's something interesting here to go back to with your image of Satoshi digging Bitcoin alpha thousands of years ago. And it's that I don't think you would know it was Bitcoin alpha when you dug it up, because
Right.
it requires experimentation to understand what proper money should have as characteristics. It's through trial and error. I might say it's through capital accumulation, a form of knowledge accumulation over time, that you will eventually come to that understanding. It's through different societies using different means of collaboration, using different ways of communicating, some of which will be simply oral. Maybe it's about IOUs and that people remember, but maybe that doesn't scale to such an extent that at some point you're going to need to use some form of physical object, or maybe it's a ledger that you're going to write things on, some Sumerian tablets, whatnot. Eventually, you find the technology, you find the Bitcoin alpha that you dug thousands of years ago, yet you didn't know at the time was going to be money. It just turns into money through that natural adoption of trial and error. And without all of that experience, Satoshi inventing Bitcoin, not Bitcoin Alpha at this time, would not have been able to come up with the required characteristics, right? It required thousands of years of experimentation to know what were the desirable characteristics of money, to then say, let's code those, and then let's use that going forward.
Okay, that's good.
That'd be a great.
Yeah, that's way better than what I said.
That'd be a great premise for like a fantasy story of some kind. You dig up Bitcoin Alpha and then you sort of get it going, and see what the consequences of the civilization are. I want to get into this question of capital, because it's just, I think it's come up every other sentence or so. I remember reading those parts of the book and highlighting parts of it and like arguing in the margins. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that capital is potential energy. I think that's a really useful framing of it. But I'm aware that some economists are somewhat uncomfortable with the idea of like human capital. It's not quite the same thing, or like social capital. It's not quite the same thing. So can you just tell me how you think about capital theory generally, and the different kinds of capital that you see, like why we should think of it that way? Why does that make sense?
I haven't encountered much pushback to the way that we articulate it. So this is actually kind of interesting. I think the first thing to mention is that that's not at all our that we've used that expression a few times. The economic potential energy that comes from Hernando de Soto. I think probably most of what we say is hopefully we do cite it appropriately. We're not trying to steal any of these ideas, but I think very little of it is actually original. Maybe just the combinations of it are original. But I mean, I would, Trent, maybe you want to go into a bit more detail about what you mean there, but I would definitely push back on the idea that, human capital, let's say, is materially economically different from, say, just a machine, right? Like that's probably the most obvious kind of tangible capital. I'm going to try to not argue this circularly, so I'm not just going to say, well, because it has economic potential energy, but sort of actually tease out,
because we defined it that way so that it would work
important in the first place. That if by human, I mean, I get that, for example, maybe this is part of the concern, that with something you would classify as human capital, precisely because it's so intangible, you certainly can't measure it in the same way. You can't observe that it's there. It's a lot more difficult to account for, I guess, and like as in accounting, right? You can much more difficult to put it on a balance sheet, I suppose. Maybe that would lead you to be more suspicious as to what exactly its productive capacity is, I guess. But to me, these are kind of trivial problems, as opposed to the more, I suppose, fundamental issue as to whether it's there. Like how easy it is to measure is not the same thing as does it exist. And to me, so once you kind of got those potential hiccups out the way, I would very strongly push back that there's really any difference whatsoever, because I would say both are, I'm really struggling to not be circular here. So both are the product of people having decided not to consume, but instead invest time and energy building the means of producing far more to consume in the future. And it shouldn't really matter whether that has physical manifestation or not, I don't think. I mean, aside from anything else, a lot of consumption doesn't have physical manifestation. So what, like, that ought to make it even more questionable why that matters.
That's a very interesting angle on it. Yeah. So you've got roundabout processes of production, which is Bern Boverick's, great insight that roundabout processes of production can actually be far, far more efficient in the long run than something more straightforward. So I mean, you can walk out your front door and start digging in the ground with your hands, or you can take 2 weeks to build a shovel, like, which is going to ultimately end up, serving you better. It's the second one, even though it's less direct. And I think you're right.
You know the joke with Milton Friedman about this, by the way? So I don't know if it's actually real or not. It might be a
He said it in Chile, right? He said, yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Go ahead. You
so Milton Friedman goes to some like building site or something, and he notices that there's very little heavy machinery, and he asks the foreman. This is almost certainly not true now that I'm saying it out loud. Yeah, but nonetheless, he asks the foreman, like, why do you not have any, like, why is there no like big heavy machines here? Why is everybody just using a shovel? And the foreman's like, oh, well, we figured this is a government sponsored thing, right? So we give people a lot more jobs if we do it this way. And then Milton Friedman says, well, you could hire way more people again if you took away the shovels and you just gave them spoons.
Right. Yeah, I believe he was in Chile when he said that. It was when he was consulting.
Oh, so it is real.
I think so. Well, so I've heard that story too, and the way I heard it, he was in Chile consulting with the new Pinochet regime, and he made some quip kind of along those lines. Who knows? I mean, legends grow. So actually, we just invented one in this call. So who knows how actually true it is? But yeah, I think I'm very sympathetic to that point. That a roundabout production process or the act of postponing consumption to invest in some sort of structure that will ultimately yield more production in the long run does not necessarily have to be tied to a machine or something physical. If you're interested, if it's something you want to chase down, I can try to dig up the reference. I was remembering a podcast, which I think was with Tom Woods, who was interviewing like an economic historian who kind of got into this. So it's one of those, like, I remembered it from 2 years ago sorts of things. So maybe it's this one lone voice that's been long debunked. I couldn't tell you for sure. If it's, like I said, if it's something you want to follow up on, I can try to facilitate that. But I just thought I would flag it as a potentially interesting point of conversation.
Yeah, sure. I think there is one thing that came to mind as you were talking, and it's maybe the pushback that some people have around quantifying capital and saying that some forms of capital are so valuable and so intrinsically worthy that you shouldn't soil that with the grubby financial world. So you can think of social capital in terms of the way in which maybe your family relationships are important to you, or your community, or your environment. We talk a lot about the value of the environment. So obviously, when it comes to something like a river or soil, that's not something that people have actively worked to create. I mean, it was there before. We can then make it more useful to us. We can try and preserve it, right? But there is a sense in which these things are beyond ourselves. So sometimes I think there is a pushback around, well, do you really want to put monetary values on everything around you? And I don't think that that's the argument that we're making either. We're saying that money is a way of communicating that is very helpful, even when it comes to sometimes touching these much more intangible forms of capital. But that doesn't mean that we should put a monetary value on how much you love your mom, or how much.
What's mom worth to you?
Yeah, exactly, right. That's not.
You just shouldn't.
Yeah.
What's more valuable, your parents or the rainforest? And you have to choose. Like, this is not the kind of thing that we're talking about. We are saying that money is a very effective way for people to communicate, and it's not the only way in which we communicate, right? This is a form of communication. There are plenty of ways of doing this. Politics is another one. Violence, warfare, that's also a form of communication. There are more or less desirable ways to communicate. money, when done well, is a very effective form of communication for many things. And it allows us to collaborate in a way that's very helpful for the accumulation of plenty of forms of capital. But that doesn't mean that we need to turn everything into a monetary value.
Yeah, I think
I'd build on that a little bit, because I think there's a kind of I'm not sure if it's quite a paradox. I might be misusing that, but it's certainly a seeming contradiction that is difficult to get, like it's very unintuitive. It's difficult to get your head around, particularly with respect to exactly these sources of capital Sacha mentions that we feel uncomfortable putting a value on. That actually, we do go into this a little bit in the book. I don't think we really dwell on it for all that long, though, that it's precisely when you when money breaks, basically, or when money dies. So that's a good good
they make a great
shilling
book.
There. It's precisely when money dies that you have to start thinking about doing that more seriously, right? And I think really what all this is testament to, it's yeah, as Ash is right, it's very much not that, oh, we want to put a value on everything, like we want to price everything. It's more that just instinctively isn't even the right word. It's deeper than that. It's kind of per every individual's subjective value. They will actually value everything in some or other way. They may not decide to express that with money, probably for a lot of things. And that comes back to exactly this tension that for some things that will feel uncomfortable, but the less access to, let's say, properly priced capital they have, and the more impoverished and desperate they become, the more they'll actually be forced to start to think about the price of things that they would rather not price at all. So it's yeah, I think that hopefully reinforces, makes a case even more strongly that we're very much not at all in favor of like pricing the rainforest or how much you love your mom, but it's precisely if you value those things so much that you don't want to think about the price, you should care about capital and money even more to ensure that you don't ever have to.
That's a really interesting take on it. I hadn't considered that before. It's when you're starving to death that you start thinking like, well, maybe it's now the time to, sell a child because they'll starve otherwise. Like they will die guaranteed, or I could sell them and maybe.
Well, this is why you should read When Money Dies.
Exactly I've got it over there.
Maybe not exactly. Yeah. I don't think anyone sold their kids, but they came close.
Yeah, I think, and I'd be interested in getting your feedback on this. Maybe this is driven in part by the sort of hysterical attempt to formalize everything in economics with mathematical models. And part of what I think draws people to Austrianism is that it's far more humanizing. Like Mises explicitly defends the private property order, the monetary order, because it not only maximizes the sorts of economic decisions people can make, but also the non-economic decisions people can make, like where they choose to live to be close to family or something like that. These are not things you would necessarily put a price on, although there's an opportunity cost. You could probably could price it right. But people make decisions for reasons just beside the monetary remuneration they can expect, and that matters too, and that can be captured by economics, if perhaps not in an actual formal model.
Yeah, that's a super interesting. Oh, sorry, go on, Saj.
I was going to say it's almost like there's a meta price. There's a price on how much you're willing to price things.
Right? Oh, that's interesting.
and the richer you are, or the more resources you have, the higher that price becomes, as in you're less and less likely to put a price on things that you really value, simply because you have the luxury of saying, no, we're going to take all of that land and we're just going to fence it, and it's going to be a nice park. Right? It could be housing, but we're just going to enjoy that. And that's not something that you're able to do when it's hand to mouth.
When you're rich enough, the marginal value of an additional dollar drops enough that you can afford to consume something like a park in the form of luxury, and just like set it aside as a reserve because it's beautiful and people like it, right?
Just to Trent, could I build on actually both of these points? So I think exactly well, let's call it Austrianism. I think it goes a little bit beyond Austrianism, but it's a helpful starting point for sure. The Austrian attitude of first of all, eschewing macro quantifications of economic behavior, and secondly, it is obviously related, but I think is a little bit distinct, taking, well, human action basically, but individual subjective value as the sort of starting point for all economic activity. I think both of those as methodological approaches make perfect sense of exactly what Sacha just described. Insofar as if that is your starting point, you're not at all confused by the way people actually behave when they do these things, right? Whereas if your starting point is something, you were Trent, you started off the question by saying, I forget, I'm not going to quote you exactly, but the fascination with putting a number on everything, right? And and modeling everything, right? That if you want to try to do that, you basically can't if you look at the Austrian starting point of people will behave in order to achieve whatever ends they value. Like you can't model that. It's just impossible. So you have to come up with these proxies for it, which are typically things like consumption, right? Like that, which in some contexts maybe makes some sense. If you have to measure something and you have to get, a relative gauge of things, like there may be some circumstances in which that's okay. And even then, provided you caveat it very, very thoroughly, right? But if your absolute measure of like economic flourishing, let's say, is just, well, how much are people consuming? Then the idea that you would fence off a piece of land as a park just to enjoy it, that's like irrational, or it might be even worse. It might be like, I'm not even sure what the right word would be. I'm sort of struggling with if it's even an economics thing or if it's like an ethical thing that they'd be implying. It's like wrong or bad or something, or it implies, it's recessionary or something like that. How dare people not be consuming when they're just kind of strolling around a park doing nothing? But it's like, but again, obviously, I think you mentioned this in your introductory comment too, Trent, that isn't confusing to regular people, right? It's only confusing to a macroeconomist.
You have to be a well-educated economist to be confused by basic stuff like that.
The idea that people would enjoy parks and like also kind of not want to price them, it makes perfect sense to me. And then it also makes perfect sense if your starting point is a more sensible one economically too.
Yeah. I wanted a piece I was writing recently, I made the analogy that iPhone was the equivalent in the phone industry to what Bitcoin did for the world of money. And when you think about that, that's probably a very imperfect analogy, but there's an evolutionary scale here that things are changing, and Bitcoin is changing as well. What are some of the features and changes that you think Bitcoin 20 years from now will have that it doesn't have today?
Ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah, actually, can I piggyback on that? Because one of the questions I was going to ask, and I didn't manage to dig it up in the book. I was like leafing through it, but you talk about like financial instruments that might be possible with Bitcoin, like I don't know, you know what I'm talking about. It's in the
I can touch on some of those if you want.
Yeah, just what it makes possible, how it will change, what it makes possible. Like, why
should I think there's an important clarification here in that I'm not sure which of these you meant, but I'll just address both. I think they're both interesting, right? So one way of interpreting this is how many more soft forks are there going to be, basically. But then I guess the more expansive way is like what else will be built on Bitcoin, right? Which are slightly different. The soft fork one, I mean, I don't think I'm remotely technically competent enough to give an answer anybody should take seriously. But I mean, I can see there being a few more worthwhile ones. I think the one that I'm probably the most sold on, which is probably just because of my connection to Blockstream, but is that eventually it would be nice if Simplicity made it in as effectively a scripting language upgrade. Because so the way that I'm completely piggybacking on Adam Back here, but the way that he often describes it is that if that were to happen, and I mean, as far as I understand it, that would be at least maybe 10, 15 years away. But if it were to happen, it would be the last upgrade, because you just wouldn't need anything after that. Because basically every protocol upgrade for a while now, the intention has been, well, what layer 2 or above does this now enable? Like in terms of the actual functioning of transferring Bitcoins, I think it's been fine for a while. Like almost everything has been geared towards more expressiveness that's like obviously useful, or maybe not obviously useful, but everybody agrees would be a good thing. That's kind of the general rule for whether you get a fork in the first place. So it's also kind of a cop out of an answer too, because it means not only does it, after that happens, does it ossify, which is kind of is desirable at some point anyway. But you then get whatever you want, and it's everybody else's, like it's every individual's problem in terms of what they want to try to build, right? So okay, so that's that out of the way. I think that the more interesting one is the expansive point about what can be built. Yeah, so I mean, Trent, you mentioned some of the stuff we went into in the book. I can go into more detail on that if you want, but like honestly, I think the more important answer is like basically anything to do with money, like anything at all. The idea of money becoming programmable, I really don't think people outside of Bitcoin have kind of cottoned on to how important this is. I might even suggest that maybe a lot of people inside a lot of Bitcoiners themselves haven't really appreciated this yet because they haven't seen it, right? Bitcoin to them is basically just a savings instrument, like an ultra long-term savings instrument. They probably still use not dollars necessarily, but like a lot of fiat in their day-to-day life. Some Bitcoiners won't. I mean, if you're either so deep in the weeds that maybe you work for a Bitcoin company and you've arranged your affairs such that you can, which I am pretty envious of. It's cool if you've ended up in that position. Then maybe you're a bit more involved and you have more of a cause, I guess, to play with some of these kind of Bitcoin native financial primitives, I guess, if you want to think of them that way. And then obviously, there'll be some people in, I guess, just countries or places, jurisdictions, etc., where the inflation is so horrendous that actually Bitcoin seems better, but it seems significantly less volatile by comparison. So they're nudged a bit further along. But I think where I'm going with all of this is I think most people by and large just really have no relevant experience of how thoroughly Bitcoin will probably penetrate finance and how finance will be re-architected, if you like, around its native programmability, and how that's super duper exciting. So I think that's a more important answer, just like everything, who knows, right? I can now go into more specific examples if you want.
Hello, this is Trent Fowler, co-host of the Futurati podcast. One of the most common pieces of marketing advice I've come across is to know your audience and give them what they want. One difficulty in podcasting is that it's actually pretty hard to do this. None of the major platforms give us any way to reach out to you, our listeners, to find out what you enjoy about the Futurati podcast and what you'd like to see done differently. So we've decided to record this commercial and ask you directly to reach out to us. Head over to futuratipodcast.com, go to the contact page, and drop us a line. Tell us about your favorite and least favorite episodes, what you'd like to see us cover in the future, and anything else you want us to know. We produce this show for you, and we want your advice so we can make it even better. Thank you.
Let me mention, we've had several discussions around the fact that, there's an estimate that somewhere between 4 and 6 million Bitcoin have already been lost. Mm-hmm. And when they're lost, they're gone. And it's conceivable that over the next 1,000 years that every remaining Bitcoin will somehow have gotten lost along the way.
Maybe.
Yeah. So having a feature, a recoverability feature or process or something seems like that might make good sense since we're dealing with a finite quantity of 21 million. And that's a key part of the survivability over the long run.
So I have two responses to that. So one is that I would find that I think I disagree. I don't think it's possible that all of it gets lost because the total amount is completely arbitrary anyway. What really matters at any point is how much you have of the total. And so say 20.9 million get lost and there's only 100,000. It would still be Bitcoin. I'm just trying to do the math on what that would be in sats. I'm actually not sure, but there's only 100,000 Bitcoin left. Then if they're sufficiently distributed, then we just redenominate everything and that's fine. I think the question about how much you need to lose isn't it's not relevant what the number of Bitcoin is. It's relevant how many holders there are. And I just can't see that ever actually happening. I mean, it would, or if it could happen, it would have obviously failed well before then. It would be like, BSV now, where there's like 2 nodes or something and it goes down because someone hacks it, or not hacks it, but like someone does a 51% attack for fun. Like, I think you need something like that before that were even possible. There was another point, or maybe it was there was something else I wanted to say.
You're saying that we'll never have an FDIC for Bitcoin.
Oh yeah, no, I wanted to push back on that too, because so you said it would be better if it was recoverable. I don't know what that even means though. What does that mean? Like you can undo transactions?
If something's been lost for, I don't know, 20 years, 50 years, that somehow it goes back into the pool.
Oh, I see. Right. So what, like it gets added to the Coinbase or something?
Yeah, that's one way you could handle it.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
But I figure if you could do that,
I never heard that before.
If you could do that, it seems to me like it would sort of undermine the fundamental value prop. Like if somebody could just sort of reverse those or pull them out, then it's like, well, I mean, what if I'm saving it for 100 years? What if it's in a trust? It's supposed to finance the expansion of my house. Right?
Yeah.
I think another factor here would be that the fewer they are, the more valuable they become as an individual Bitcoins. So your incentive not to lose them becomes incredibly high. So I think the fewer they are, the less likely it is that you would lose them. I mean, it's very hypothetical. And also I just wanted to add, maybe going back to the initial question around what financial products we might see developing on Bitcoin. I think an interesting way of answering that is what financial products we would see disappear. And I think that's also back to the question of what it enables, because so what you were saying, Alan, with basically we can do anything with money. I think some people listening to this might think, okay, so does that look like hyper financialization? Does that look like
that's a good point? Yeah,
derivatives on derivatives on derivatives on levered on, and then you have some kind of swap, and if this happens, then I exchange the interest rate on that. And no, that's not where this is going, I believe, in a sense that we do talk about the fact that debt and many financial instruments are facilitated by having a essentially bailout of last resort every time something goes wrong, right? If that's not on the table, or it becomes much more difficult in the sense that governments would have to directly tax people to then do these bailouts rather than just do it surreptitiously with printing money, you will see financial instruments probably become much simpler. So I think there is a sense in which they become more complex, in the sense, not complex, they perhaps have more, you can build conditionality, you can build intelligence into those contracts, but that doesn't mean that they would become more fragile. Because for me, debt is about increasing fragility, in the sense that you're saying, I will require a fixed payment in a world where nothing is fixed. And so what I have just done is I have made the rest of the world more volatile, because I am asking my little share of the world to essentially be stable. And since I can't reduce instability in the overall system, I'm just increasing instability in the rest of the system rather than my little part where I'm asking for debt to be really stable. So I'm just trying to think about implications broadly. And I think that maybe conditional instruments that are also very resilient and more inclined to respond to the variability of the real environment and economy in which we live is perhaps a direction that we'll see going into.
Can I just add one thing to that, actually, just to make it even more tangible for people? And this is kind of funny given what Sacha and my background is, even though I've quit, so I'm in the clear now. But there will be significantly less asset management for one. I think probably not none. I think this is like, I end up saying this for almost everything that I think Bitcoin's kind of paced to enormously disrupt. So like debt, I'd probably make the same argument for debt. There'll be significantly less debt. There probably won't be none, but there'll be significantly less. But asset management in particular, basically because an enormous amount of asset management is without anybody, or certainly most of the people involved in, the little bubble in which they have a role, right? Because it's an enormously complex, like interconnected industries. It's basically impossible to see it as a whole, right? Everyone only sees their tiny little silo. Without them being aware, really, the actual purpose that a lot of it is serving is just yield chasing, right? The reason a lot of it exists is, like, I would argue probably the majority of it exists, is because it's impossible for the end savers to actually save. There's very little sort of deliberate, kind of intentional direction of capital towards risk-seeking enterprise, like that actually wants to be deployed, right? It's sort of, there's so many middlemen that all intention is lost, and it's just self-serving in the end. But it's self-serving in a particularly perverse way that is nonetheless justified because of inflation, right? You actually need this, right? You can't, if people just had to save on their own, they'd be even more screwed. So I think that's kind of a good example of what Sacha was mentioning of, what disappears is as interesting, if not more so, than what emerges.
I know. I think that's all fascinating. And it does a really good job of sort of concretizing some of the discussion around how the current financial system tends to shunt volatility to different places. It's almost like you've got a law of conservation of volatility.
Yeah.
And if you work really hard to make this stable and predictable over the long term, well, that's got to go somewhere, right? And so other places become less predictable.
Are you enjoying this episode of the Futurati podcast? If so, please like it, give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share it with your friends. By far, the best way to help us grow is to spread the word on social media, which will expose our content to more people and help us continue to bring you interviews with world-leading experts in AI, quantum computing, cryptocurrencies, and so much more. Thank you in advance.
So a while back, I wrote a paper. Well, this is actually in 2008. I wrote a paper called Fractal Transactions. And it's the idea that sometime in the future we would have micro payments, even nano payments available. And so if somebody buys a product, let's just take a book, for example. Somebody buys a book, the money that goes for that book would automatically get divvied up to, part of it would go to the author, maybe 10% would go to the printer, maybe 2% would go to the editor, maybe 1% would go to the cover designer. And so throughout the life of this product, every time somebody makes a purchase, this money instantly flows to all of these people that contributed to this product. And it's a vastly different way of thinking about things. And I just kind of wanted to get your reaction to something like that. Is that a possibility in the future with Bitcoin or some of the other cryptocurrencies that we could actually achieve something like that?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. I mean, I think there are places where you can see that already. I mean, that's very much where it's sort of taken on the moniker of podcasting 2.0 is going. Like, this already exists. But I mean, I agree that it's a very small niche and it's very kind of Bitcoin centric at the moment. But the model seems pretty clear that, yeah, that's by far the healthiest way, or maybe not in absolute terms, but of the options we have, that is the healthiest way to align the incentives of everybody contributing to that kind of product. And I think you can maybe even go a bit further and make a kind of I guess an ethical case to some extent, that given that you can opt into there being a kind of transparency involved as well in terms of where the funds are going, that you would probably argue for anybody paying for it, they would prefer to see that that's where the money is going to. So yes, basically, I think that'll become much more widespread for sure.
In that type of situation, if all of a sudden you have 1 billion people that are somehow tied to a financial model like this, and their daily earnings are dependent upon the flow of transactions, then it's easy to see how a payment system like this gets ingrained in society in a way unlike anything in the past, that this becomes kind of the heartbeat of commerce, the heartbeat of livelihood for so many people around the world.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I mean, I think if anything, the way you articulated it there is an even stronger point than something I remember we do say in the book at one point, which is it's a little bit more specific to Lightning, and as was my previous answer around podcasting, but where we say that it's on course to contribute to re-architecting the internet, or maybe the web more specifically, but that the web will be re-architected around Lightning. But yeah, I think that the entire world will be re-architected around Bitcoin. Why not?
That's fantastic. I wanted to leave a little side here, set aside a little time here at the end to ask some audience questions, which I went to the Bitcoin Venetians chat and said, we're talking to Alan and Sacha. What do you guys want to know? And one of them asked for a response to a tweet, which actually I think, Alan, you did respond to in the thread. Okay. But so you can just phone this in if you like. So this is from Mike Brock. You probably remember this. He's a self-described non-Austrian Bitcoiner, and he says government can still
I know
control.
he is. I don't know why he doesn't follow me. It's very rude. You know him,
Mike, follow Alan. He's great.
I'm a reply guy. I'm always there. I mean, maybe it's because I'm usually annoying him. But anyway, yeah. What did he say?
He said that government can still control the supply of credit in a hyper Bitcoinized world. I know as long as government controls credit standards and leverage ratios for lending, you're still, in capital letters, manipulating the money supply. Total money in an economy includes credit. It's actually most of it. Your response, Dr. Farrington.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is a simple response. I think the reason that tweet is so interesting, the reason there's a gazillion replies to it and then the gazillion threads of their own that come from it, is that he's touching on a lot of, he's actually basically trolling everybody because he's touching on so many interesting things, all of which can be objected to, I suppose. But I don't even think he's wrong. I don't think. I think maybe my perspective is slightly different. And I alluded to this earlier in this conversation, that I think there will be significantly less, to the point of possibly negligible, credit on a Bitcoin standard. And so even though he's right, he may just be right on a kind of a technicality in a way that doesn't really matter in real life. I think there's another point that he doesn't mention as well, which is that, and it's surprising given where he works. I'm pretty sure he works at, I think he heads Web 5 at Block. But anyway, that I don't think he's giving enough credit to, or maybe just doesn't believe it in the first place, the pressure on states that Bitcoin will eventually bring to bear, such that they will have to start competing with each other, and probably there'll be a lot more of them. They will be smaller. That's a whole other. I'm kind of taking that for granted. The audience will have to take that for granted now as well. It's like chapter 9. That's chapter 9. Read that. But if that's true, then for that reason, also this point is less relevant, because any individual government trying to do that will be to a large extent shooting itself in the foot, at least to whatever extent those regulations around credit are simply not accepted by the market, right? If the purpose of them is something like I don't know, just protecting consumers, let's say, and facilitating a functioning market in the first place, something like that. It's basically what every regulation claims it's doing, and then hardly any of them ever actually do. Maybe then that will attract capital, and then he'll be kind of right in a little bit in some specific corner. But if they mess it up at all, then not only because of what I just described in terms of chapter 9, the pressure Bitcoin has, but the fact that it's just natively digital, right? It just, capital flight is instant, like literally instant. It'll just leave right away. It'll lend itself. Well, no, it won't lend itself, but its owners will redirect it to a more favorable jurisdiction. So for a whole bunch of reasons, I think that he's right, but for a whole bunch of reasons, I think it probably doesn't matter that he's right.
So your reply is sure, comma, so what?
Yeah, Yeah, that's a good one.
Another way of saying this is you may force this to happen. If it's not the right thing, eventually the system will break. And how will you bail it out? You're going to have to use force again, and all of it will have to be overt. Eventually the system will learn that that's not a good idea. So you may still be doing things. I think one of the pushback I commonly see is, yeah, but if governments use force, this can still happen. I'm like, all right, yes, but at least we'll be learning from these events in a way that's not possible today, so that the amount of force you need to use to continue goes up. The cost of it goes up every time because people understand that that's not a good idea. If you force some capital requirements that cause banks to fail or go bust every time, and you constantly have to overtly tax your populace to bail, eventually you'll come to an understanding that's just not the right thing to do in a way that's not clear today because it's hidden.
So it removes the sneakier options that states have currently to finance things like bailouts.
You can still, you could still, if you could be Keynesian, you could have a Keynesian system with a Bitcoin standard in the sense that you would need to tax your population, overtly say, okay, we're going to tax you, we're going to hold that in reserve, and when there's an economic downturn or something, we're going to be spending that. Okay, we're going to now counteract it. We've got coins in reserve, and boom, boom, we're spending. Here we go. But when you run out of coins, what are you going to do? You're going to need to either get them through taxation, through violence. Like there's going to be some means through which you're going to acquire those coins, and that's going to have to be open. That's going to have to be something that people are able to see. So there is no lying in a Bitcoin standard, and that's what we were saying about communication. You will have to be transparent, right? This is back to the Bible. The truth will set you free, in the sense that you will have to be honest with each other, and we will therefore have the ability and the opportunity to learn from our interactions. And from that will come, hopefully, over time, better systems, better ways of organizing each other. And if the right system is to have the government dictate what a capital requirement for banks is, we will figure that out. That will eventually come out through the iterative process of trial and error. I don't think that's where we'll end up, but that could be it. I'm not going to claim I know what the end point of it is. I just say that I have an appreciation for the process through we can get there is. Like that's the whole insight of capital and capital accumulation, right? We've been talking about this whole time.
So by having this honest underlying monetary standard, then the experiments just have to be conducted in the open. It's almost like, it's a fairly inexact analogy, but it's almost like pre-registering your results or your predictions for a study. So you can't go back and gerrymander the data later or torture it to get it to say what you want. It's like, this is what we expect, and if we don't get this, we're wrong, right? And then you do the experiment, and if you are right, then you get more points than otherwise.
Exactly.
It's almost like MMA, one might say.
So Bitcoin is truth. Bitcoin is logos, one might say. And then another question I wanted to get to is, this came from Probabilistically Certain, which is his Twitter handle. He says that Jeff Snyder has finally beaten me into submission somewhat regarding the global difficulties created by the dollar shortage. If the dollar shortage is real and problematic, what kind of issues would be created by a Bitcoin standard, and how could they be addressed? I feel like some of this was contained in the prior answer.
I'm not entirely sure what the question means.
Well, so I wasn't either.
Referring to the fact that basically everybody is short the dollar, and as a result of the dollar being the reserve currency. Is that what he's talking about?
That's how I read it too. So right now you've got a system where the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. If there are dollar shortages, that's really problematic. And as we Bitcoinize, you could also get similar sorts of wrinkles, because we're sort of presupposing the dollar is a really important pillar in the monetary order. And as that gets displaced, there could be issues. What should we do about that sort of thing?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I don't think I have a particularly good answer to this. I don't know, Sacha, do you want to jump in? I can just rattle stuff off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely understand the question, because when you say a shortage of dollar, that almost makes me think that the person implies there is a correct quantity of money that should be out there, rather than just to say that, as we said before, if 21 million Bitcoins, if you lose half of them, does that mean that we're now short of coins? Like, was 21 million the optimal amount? No, it's just about how you allocate the coins that you do have. So it's been tempting throughout history for people to say, we need more currency, so we're going to have to print, we're going to have to increase, it's going to stimulate the economy, or whatever argument you want to use. I don't believe that the quantity, the absolute amount, is what matters, because you can denominate your price in whatever amount you want. It could be 100 times higher, 1,000 times higher, 1,000 times lower. Doesn't matter. So I take issue with the premise that you would need a specific quantity, but I need to dig into what that person meant, because I'm not quite sure I really got the question.
Well, it may be sort of an artifact of the petrodollar system, right? So we set it up so that people have to denominate their oil in dollars, and therefore people need dollars in order to purchase the oil, which creates a lot of dollar demand. But if there's not enough dollars in the system, that creates problems, and therefore we've sort of run the structural trade deficit with all of Earth to make sure there are enough dollars in the system. He never said any of that. I'm just sort of I'm pattern matching. I'm just running it through GPT-3.
Well, there's a name for that, right? What is it? Triffin's paradox?
Triffin's dilemma?
Something.
The Triffin dilemma?
Yeah.
But
so is the question just what happens when the Triffin dilemma unwinds? Is that what he's getting at?
Well, you could answer that, and maybe that is what he wants. I don't actually know. I don't know.
I think there's two completely different answers. So one is, I mean, just to be really glib about it, as it unwinds, it's horrible, but when it finally unwinds, it's amazing. That's like the gist of what any longer answer would be anyway. No, seriously, like I've started making a point of saying this lately whenever I get asked something along the line, like a far more general version of this, like, how do you see the next X many years playing out? Like, it's going to be bad, basically. Probably shouldn't even be laughing as I say that one of the reasons that, if not the main reason, maybe not the only reason, but the main reason that I like Bitcoin so much is because I really, really dislike fiat. It's like, it's not even so, I've said this a few times now, I should maybe get it on a t-shirt, right? It's like not pro Bitcoin, anti fiat. But one of the problems, this is actually kind of a cute way of linking it back to exactly what we've been talking about, that the exact reason I dislike fiat is its corrupting influence on not just capital, but almost prior to that, the ability to communicate and to understand reality, right? Because you may as well assume that all the information you have about it, insofar as it is economic, is just wrong in some way, and that the way people are acting probably doesn't actually reveal their preferences because they're also acting on incorrect information, and it's all horribly reflexive and blah, 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 blah. But so you can predict that that's going to lead somewhere really bad. But unfortunately, you also have to accept that if you believe that, you have to accept that you can't predict what that bad thing is going to be, right? Like, it could be anything. It could happen at any time. Like, Sacha and I were actually, again, maybe not joking, I'm not sure we're laughing about it so much, but like when the thing in the UK with the gilts and the LDI and so on happened, it's like, well, sure, like, yeah, nobody knew about this until now, but now, yeah, well, of course that was going to happen. But I mean, everything that of course was going to happen, nobody knew it was going to happen beforehand, because nobody can like really see the truth, basically. None of the actual, this may be quite a good slogan, right? None of the information is in the price. All the prices are wrong, which means the information you're inferring from them is also wrong. So sorry, I'm going on a bit of a rant here, but like, I have no idea exactly what's going to happen. I don't know exactly how the Triffin dilemma is going to unwind. I just think it'll be extremely unpleasant, but it will be a good thing because we have Bitcoin. I think that's also an interesting contrast to make, that, and it fits in with my not pro Bitcoin so much as anti-fiat quite a bit as well, that it certainly won't unwind because of Bitcoin. If anything, the existence of Bitcoin might make it smoother because people can kind of exit one by one. Whereas if it were to happen on its own, it would be, it'd be like 2008, basically. It would all come down at once.
You can move as opposed to like trying to pull all your belongings out of a burning house, right? Like it can be more stable. And there's a similar analogy there. It's like, why do you lock your doors at night? Well, I don't have a particular scenario in mind. It's just there's a wide variety of things that I don't want to happen, and therefore I lock my doors at night. It's not a particular one. It's just on general principle. It's some basic security. I can't predict
that's
what
will happen. About it too,
but if you chronically take these risks, I can't tell you which time it will blow up in your face, but eventually it will.
Mm-hmm.
So in light of all that, in light of the fact that you're not pro Bitcoin, you're anti-fiat, do you have that should be the headline. Alan Farrington comes out against Bitcoin. What are there any criticisms?
Yeah, had a good run.
are there any? Bitcoin is awful. That's the title. Bitcoin sucks. Yeah.
Do you need a dynamic and knowledgeable speaker for an event? Thomas Fry and me, Trent Fowler, are both seasoned keynote speakers, able to converse on a wide array of topics to audiences of all sizes and skill levels. Go to the contact page at futuraudypodcast.com to book Thomas or myself today, and let us apply our years of experience in public speaking to make your event a smashing success.
Are there any criticisms of Bitcoin that you find particularly compelling?
So it depends exactly what you mean. I not criticisms exactly, but I'm not even sure what else to call it. Like reasons it might fail. Yes, I'm not sure there's any criticisms of Bitcoin I find at all compelling, because they tend to be profoundly uninformed and like obviously political once you dig into them. But there are a few. I'm really not sure how to describe that difference. I don't know if someone wants to offer a like a good name for that. Any ideas? What would you call that?
Like potential failure modes is against actual criticism.
Yeah, failure mode. That's a good report. So there's one that I usually say Joe Kelly's when we talk about this. I'm getting kind of bored of that though, because it's nothing against Joe. It's just it's kind of mechanical, I guess. It's basically that 51% attacks are easier than people assume, especially in a longer and longer time horizon. I think that is credible. I think I have a good answer to it, but I won't go into that now because I want to mention what I think is a more interesting one, right? So this is due to Ben Hunt, who on Twitter goes by Epsilon Theory.
Oh yeah.
I'm sure some people will know who this is. I think his handle is Epsilon Theory. He still uses his name Ben Hunt, but that comes from him being a contributor, I think the founder of a really good blog called Epsilon Theory, which I do highly recommend people read. It's nothing to do with Bitcoin. It's just kind of finance commentary, but like highly contrarian finance commentary. So he has this idea that, and even here, to be clear, I don't think he thinks this is going to happen. I think he just thinks this is a danger that is underappreciated. And I think I agree that it is a danger and it is underappreciated and it is worth taking seriously, that the state co-opts Bitcoin in such a way that trying to think exactly how to describe this. They nudge every non-Bitcoiner onto a whitelisted version. And so, and they accompany this with relentless propaganda about how dangerous, non-government Bitcoin is. And then we end up in this position, which is weirdly similar to, and this is, I think the scariest thing is that there's an obvious precedent for this, which is how everybody uses email, right? So you can run an SMTP server if you want, you just set one up in your garage, whatever, do your own DNS, like actually run it all on your own. Basically nobody does. Almost everybody uses Google, Outlook, probably some people still use Yahoo, AOL, whatever, right? And so I don't think there was ever like a big cultural movement around this, but there's a clear analogy to Bitcoin, right? In terms of like, oh, you got to run your own node and not your keys, not your coins and all that, that there could well have been people in like early email, or I guess more like early web commercialization, who were really mad about this. They're like, no, you gotta run your own, like the whole point is it's decentralized, you got to do it yourself. But like nobody cared, right? And in the end, everybody ends up on these massively centralized services. I think that could happen to Bitcoin because it already happened, basically. Like I also don't think it would have mattered at all how loudly, I don't think these people even existed, but if they did, I don't think it would have mattered how loudly they shouted, because the state, and I also keep in mind, I think in the historical comparison, it was just kind of an accident. It was like, market forces effectively. Whereas in this case, I'm positing that it is literally a conspiracy, right? So there's a lot of intent going into misleading people around this. And I'm pretty sure that like the US government, for example, could do a better propaganda campaign than Bitcoin Twitter could in response to it. And so, yeah, I think that's actually a reasonably credible threat. I think the only way to combat it, I think, to be fair, I do also think it's unlikely because it requires a high degree of competence, like a far, far higher degree of competence than I think they have. Hence, we're in this position in the first place. Right. I don't think the probability is zero, though. I think it could happen. I think the way around it is education. I think actually having that in the back of my mind is why I think onboarding noobs basically is super important, and far more so in terms of understanding it rather than buying it necessarily. Obviously, you'd prefer if they bought it as well. You'd prefer if they ran a node, etc. But getting actually accurate information to people as quickly as possible, I think, is the best defense against that.
We could draw an analogy with gold in a way. We had the gold standard. It's not practical carrying gold around, so we just left it in the bank vault.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had paper money because that's a much more convenient interface. And eventually the gold disappeared that was behind it. If there is a need for a more user-friendly interface in front of Bitcoin for people to use, there is a world in which that interface becomes the main way in which people think about money, and then you just remove the back end eventually, like we did with gold. I think that's one mode of failure I can imagine. Another one that's perhaps linked to what we've been discussing throughout this podcast is how difficult it is to own up to truth. What if I told you you could not tell a lie for just a week? You had to be completely honest with everyone you're interacting with. That's super difficult. I don't know if society is ready for that. No, but seriously, it is incredibly, I don't think people realize how important lies are sometimes to just keeping things civil. And so what happens if we are in a world where we're forced to be honest with each other? I can see again some friction there on the way to learning the way in which we can then collaborate. Like there would still be difficult moments where we're all having to accept that we lied to each other and it's completely blatant and people are getting really angry. And then what do? You have to resolve that. Bailouts would be a really interesting sort of moment. I mean, I think failure, like systemic failure of institutions and bailouts would become much more politically difficult to overcome. Like not just the act of bailing something out, but just what we would need to reckon with as a society. And so where does that leave us? Like that could be it's very not metaphorical. It's perhaps a bit too theoretical and maybe too grandiose, but I think there is something about how much truth we can take and therefore the speed at which we can adopt this. I don't know. It's one of the sort of very long-term things that I think about sometimes, but it is very theoretical.
It's almost like if you banned clothes for a week, it's like there'd be a lot of pain as people like adjust to that reality and like get a little bit more sun and work out a little bit more. Like you've been concealing a lot under those sweaters, for a while now, and the pandemic way, like you got to get in shape again because people are going to see it.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic, guys. Do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
No, just the book's free in case the audience didn't know that. You can buy a physical copy if you want. I think Trent, you already showed that you had one, right? But you can, if you don't want it on dead trees, if you don't mind a digital copy, don't have to pay anything at all.
Fantastic. And where can people go to learn more about you two and your work?
Probably just Twitter, really. That's fine. Let's kind of coordinate everything through there.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much, guys. It's been a long time in the making. I loved the book, loved all the ideas. The book club loved it as well. We had some great conversations out of it. So thanks for putting it together. Thanks for putting it out there. And we appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.